Thank you so much for inviting me, a feminist political scientist, to kind of close this wonderful, mostly historians conference on breaking the glass chamber. I think conferences at the beginning and at the end of the summer are so inspiring because either you need inspiration to finish papers or you've got something to keep you going through the next academic term. So thank you so much for indulging me and allowing me to think about what the changes have really been. And that did make force me to read a book that I wrote based on my PhD and then a subsequent set of interviews, which is kind of scary going back to something written quite so long ago. 1997 is a long time ago, you forget, right? A few years ago I was jogging on Brighton seafront and I realised I'd graduated 30 years previously, and that was quite scary. Anyway, we're all getting old. So I'm going to now ask you for a little bit of indulgence. Think back, if you were born, if you were capable of thinking back in a conscious way to 1997. It's election night. I'd moved my little tiny telly that stood on I was a bit Muji obsessed at the time. I had a little tiny TV stand, and I moved the television into the bedroom, one bedroom flat in Clapham. And I had my Muji notebooks, I've got lots of those, as the history of my PhD, and a purple pen. And I've got a list of all these Labour women candidates who've agreed to let me interview them after the election, and I'm ticking them off as they keep getting elected and the BBC is covering them. And at some point I just think they're all getting in. And I can stop this desperate going over like 6 or 7 pages of all of their names and their addresses and how I'm going to contact them. And so we've heard quite a bit about numbers in the last few days, that 97 was a watershed election. The numbers of women jumped from 60 to 120. 101 of these are Labour women. 35 of them are elected on all women shortlists. So we know the figures, but I think sometimes we pass over them quite quickly and we don't think about what we invest in those numbers and what we can do with those numbers. We've also heard in the last couple of days how the Parliamentary Labour Party today is majority female. So if we're imagining a Labour MP, we should be imagining a woman. And that's really quite transformative. And I think that raises really serious questions about the extent to which we've had institutional regendering. Now, the Labour Party, I'm not suggesting, has become a feminist institution, but it's much more feminised than it was. And I think it's really important at this point, of course, to draw attention to Farah's contribution, her keynote, which reminded us that we might have a feminisation of sorts, a feminisation with limits, and we need to look at those intersections about which women are able to be present and successfully present in our political parties. And nor am I suggesting, of course, that the feminisation of one political party is sufficient. There are interesting questions about, and I guess they're normative questions. If you believe in the equality of women, should we be working, actively supporting efforts to ensure that all political parties are gender equal? And how far on the far right of that spectrum do we wish to go if we do want to see equality, political equality amongst political party members, activists, candidates and members of Parliament? What I really tried to argue in the then PhD and then the book was that we need to be very careful about counting, even though it's critically important that we do count. So it's only ever the beginning of trying to understand what's going on within politics. We often, at the time, were obsessed with this question of what difference do women make, and we sometimes still ask it. Julie just looked at me really quizzically then. And we have to really be careful again about what we as academics, scholars, feminists, activists invest in that idea of difference. What kind of difference? Difference compared to whom? Difference in terms of the extent that we are looking for. Rainbow Murray, who of course is a professor of politics and gender here, wrote recently in the context of Liz Truss, drawing on this book about my claim that you shouldn't confuse women's bodies with feminist minds. And I've said that this week, and I think it's so important to hold on to that notion. We shouldn't have certain expectations. We might want them, but is it legitimate to hold all women to a feminist standard? And if we are going to do that, we need to be very explicit about what that might mean. Now, I was pretty confident with these Labour women, and I'm sure those of you who were politically active, either as academics or in the civil society space at the time, would also have been quite positive, right? Many of these 1997 women had had quite long apprenticeships into Parliament because of the kind of gatekeeping role that political parties play. They had often been active in women's movement or women's charities or women's gender equality practices. So lots of them were self-identifying as feminists and had histories of feminist activism, whether that was within the Labour Party, trying to change the party, or outside of that. It's also true that at the time I was pretty confident that politics can change, that whilst our politics is masculinised, it can be regendered. A number of times in the last couple of days, people have talked about the agency, either explicitly or implicitly, of individual actors and how they have been able to effect change. And it was interesting yesterday that the Labour women on the panel talked very strongly, making that claim to have really transformed the content of the new Labour government. Now, we know other dynamics are always in play. And we also need to be aware of the extent to which those other dynamics may be resisting either feminised or feminist change. And I want to draw that distinction because we might want to think about the inclusion of women and maybe even the inclusion of women's issues into political institutions or onto political agendas. But I think we want to hold on to this concept of feminist, even though it's hugely complicated, as, again, Julie's and Clarissa's work has troubled in some ways understandings of what it might mean for different gendered political actors from different parties when they are making claims about what is in the interests of women. So you might share a political agenda to address concerns that we might either consider to be women's issues or might be inductively emerging as women's issues. Right? So as I'm trying to think who said it this morning, I think it was Sophia, my former colleague, security is sometimes considered a women's issue. We don't have to start a priori thinking that we know what constitutes women's issues. But I always want to think about interest, what is in the interests of women and which women. And therefore that gives us that really difficult, complex concept of feminism and what it might mean to be represented well. It's one of those clever slides that I can't change. It was part of a research bid and somebody paid a lot of money to make those clever slides, so we'll just do it all in one go. So I want to also contextualise this keynote that revisits essential questions of gender and representative politics, of political equality, of participation and representation, against a backdrop where we have global issues that have a very gendered face, whether that's security, climate change, economic inequality, where we've got democratic erosion and backsliding, where we've got increasing, and again, Sophia mentioned this earlier on, violence against women in politics, which people in established democracies used to think happened over there in weaker democracies, and we didn't need to worry about it. And in fact, we know that we do, and we need to, again, recognise that particularly in the UK, it's going to be black and other minority ethnic women who are going to be subjected to the more regular, the more persistent kind of violence. And that affects the extent to which those women either participate or how they participate. And that too has implications for what they speak about and how they speak about it. So my contribution also tries to think about academia. Obviously, I won't go on for like 4 hours. But I do want to recognise collaboration and the extent to which many of the ideas that I'm going to sort of try to seamlessly weave in with other keynotes from this conference is collaborative work, whether that's with great colleagues Rosie Campbell and Karen Seelis on theory and then also on gender and representation, but colleagues Sonia Palmieri on gender-sensitive parliaments, on women's issues, what counts as women's issues, with Jennifer Curtin, Johanna Cantlar and Mona Lena Crook, but also on political parties. I want to mention men, Peter Allen, Paul Webb, Phil Cowley. It's fascinating, this historic, how do you call yourselves? Is it a historians conference? Because I keep saying it's a historic conference. It sounds kind of weird, doesn't it? Historians. I think there's probably more men in the history lot who come to yes, I'm getting a good nod from Farah. But actually Queen Mary's got men, or has had men, who do some gender politics. So I think that's really interesting too. So I wanted to recognise that. So this story, if you like, of understanding the feminisation of British politics post-1997 needs to recognise there's academic collaborations that actually keep us motivated, but also keep us more ambitious in our research questions. So we've got, if you like, this context that I think makes these questions about the extent to which we've seen a feminisation of British politics even more urgent. So if it was urgent back then to redress what Karen and I call the poverty of women's representation, it probably matters even more now, despite some of the gains. Because actually the political context is much more problematic in terms of healthy, or rather less strong democracies, and the threats where actually women's rights and women's bodies are the sites of democratic erosion. They're not just the consequence of democratic erosion or backsliding. The people, the actors, the parties who wish to take democracies in a more authoritarian or anti-democratic direction will be mobilising against the most marginal women in the first instance, and gender equality in the round as well. And I think those of us who are studying these questions cannot absolve ourselves or deny this kind of really hostile and problematic context within which we are operating. I also want to make a case for, in fact, you said this earlier on, Peter, of actually being able to speak to the real world of politics, to actually be able to offer up solutions. So with Rosie, I've talked about the feminist imperative, that as gender and politics scholars, we often want to change the world and not just study it, right? So it matters that we can make recommendations, whether that's to political parties or to the media, whether that's social media companies, but also to parliaments, about how they need to transform themselves. So we need to be able to make demands on those institutions and organisations and political arenas where politics takes place. When I opened up New Labour Women MPs, I did, as I said, have a bit of a gulp and think, my goodness, what am I going to think of this after? It's amazing how you don't read early stuff after a while. You think, I know what's in that, and then you have to go back and read it. But it is interesting to see how some of our conceptual language has changed in those 20-odd years, that we're naming much more explicitly features or observations that we didn't have words for. So we didn't have violence against women in politics, at least in British politics at that time. I was thinking back about the way in which all women shortlists were contested in Welsh politics pre-1997. I don't know why we didn't call that violence against women in politics. We said it was there was a little bit of unhappiness, a little bit of pushback. We didn't name it as part of that continuum. And I'm as guilty as anybody else, right? This is not me blaming other people. But we weren't in a place where we were naming that because, as I said, violence against women happened in countries that weren't quite as well established or democratic as us. I also really want to call attention to the way in which studies, and again this includes my own, have often been very discreet in looking at descriptive representation or substantive representation, that idea of the extent to which women politicians are acting in the interests of women. Or we've looked to the way in which symbolic representation is being either recognised to be more gender inclusive or not. And increasingly, and this is with my work with Karen, is the idea that we need to think about representation less as the adding up of discrete dimensions, but actually as a mélange, and that we need to have much more creative ways of understanding when women are well represented. So counting bodies won't be sufficient. Looking at what policy changes or policies are being advocated might not be sufficient, because we might not always like the women descriptive representatives who are making claims that we might agree with, but we don't like. So we talk about, we need to be able to distinguish between the good, the bad, and the ugly representative. So if we take someone from the far right, like Marine Le Pen, she gets a tick. She's a good descriptive representative of women. She increasingly is talking about some issues that we might think of as being part of the mainstream feminist agenda around abortion rights. She says that's, it's done and settled in France, don't need to worry about it. We might be appreciative of her concern for working class women, but we can't just package those bits off, right? We have to recognise the way in which, and the claims she's making, the Islamophobia, the ethno-nationalism involved. And so that idea of a mélange, which I know might feel somewhat difficult to grab hold of, but nonetheless I think enables us to move away from this discrete kind of approach to understanding what's going on. I think it's also the case in the early work, we recognised that women were entering institutions that had particular ways of doing politics. And there was talk, and I did the same kind of stuff myself. Is there a different style of politics that women, the kind of caring, sharing, consensual approaches. But I don't think we were really talking about the extent to which we hadn't appreciated the insights that people like Johnny Lowandowski would later tell us, that these are masculinized elite institutions that reproduce those structures of gender, race, class, sexuality, inequalities, and that we need to be recognizing these as masculinized institutions of gender insensitive and diversity insensitive houses of parliament. So when I look back critically on what has happened since 1997 and what still needs to happen, I'm trying to inspire you, but I also really do want to emphasize that the idea of the ever onward and upward trajectory is a complacent position that we cannot afford to take, not just because of the global problems around democracy, but because I think what we're also seeing is institutional resistance by those actors who are seeing that gender power has transformed some aspects of politics, and those who have lost power very rarely wish to concede. And I think we are seeing some indications that women have gained power through, perversely, those who are trying to resist. So I'm going to just give you a few quick numbers, but don't worry, I'm not going to do anything too dramatic. But sometimes those visual representations can be worth looking at. So that big 92, 97 is a doubling of the numbers of women. So we've had another doubling, but that was one election, and that's now like 25 years, right? So again, we need to think about the pace of change and also the missing women. If we're looking for parity, then we've still got a missing 100 or so women, okay? I've also said that we need to think about party representation here. So we're still seeing the ongoing asymmetry. And I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. Before, I also want to talk about why 1997 is so critical. Because of the way in which those women were elected, the use of quotas, I know it's not everybody's cup of tea, I don't care anymore. It works, the global evidence, I mean, argue if that, you know, when I'm walking to King's Cross or whatever, argue that point with me. But I think it is important. The point was made that landslide elections is when we get more women in, and it's really important in 97 that of the 66 extra seats that Labour won, only 11 of those were women. So it was the landslide election, but it wasn't the landslide bit that got them all in. It was a party intervention that put women in Labour's winnable and empty held seats. And it also protected those women from the inevitable sort of decline of Labour over time. And I think that also really, really matters. This picture matters because it reminds us of the gap between our two main political parties. So if you care about the representation of women, it makes practical sense to also care about conservative women. I mean, I want to say ignore the Liberal Democrats because their numbers are much smaller, which is why they look like they've got great percentage. So again, when we think about parliaments and numbers, always look at numbers and percentages because they can often give you misleading security in terms of how well things are going. Now, I'm someone who thinks counting matters. We don't have parity, so we've got to keep counting. But I'm also someone who doesn't believe in magic in numbers. I don't think there's anything inevitable about that difference. So I'm a critic, if you like, of critical mass theory. Politics isn't like physics. I think we have to look at critical actors. I think we have to look at critical moments. I think we have to look at the extent to which it is the actions of individuals creating coalitions, operating with allies, some of whom will be male allies, to bring about political change. So any analysis of what's going on within a national parliament has to look at the distribution of women across parties. And I suppose the question I would pose is we should be happier, shouldn't we, if all of those parties were at the same level? You might want to disagree with that, but I think that would be where I would go if I take the logic from the normative claim about women's equal presence. The importance of political parties as gatekeepers and their decisions about how they intervene. We sometimes hear people say things like, I don't like quotas, we just need something that works, which is why I get really irritated. Or we should recognise political parties have the right to choose how they select their members, and if it's unequal at the end, well, that's the way it is. We are so light in terms of regulating our political parties. We could change our laws on party regulation and we could make a difference in who they select by incentivising change behaviour. There's some fantastic examples around the world how if a party has over a certain percentage of candidates, they get an extra free election broadcast. I know we don't have, the same kind of monetary party funding, but if we were trying to incentivise parties to respond to your critique, Farah, if we had party regulation, we could do something about that. These are conscious choices. The government has on its books Section 106 of the Equality Act 2010, which about 4 years ago I used to spend all my time talking about, but I think I've given up on that campaign. I mean, I haven't, but it's going nowhere and I can't imagine this government's going to go on it. But that would create a requirement for candidate diversity data. It wouldn't transform our political parties overnight, but it would force them to have to defend the outcomes of their selection process, which at the moment they just wake up every election, general election, going, oh dear, what a shame, we didn't get that many women, but we'll get more next time. And then you wait 4 years and the same thing happens, right? So I think we need to think and be quite demanding of what our parties are actually doing. And that's very difficult in a context where regulation is slight and where there is no political will to do very much about it, unfortunately. I think it's also important that we move beyond just counting women and/or just counting black and minority ethnic MPs. We've got to go beyond single axis or even dual axis identification. So we need to get to grips with that question of which women are present and how do we know which kind of women and men are being returned to our parliaments. There is, if you like, a tradition, because we don't have candidate diversity data, looking at photographs. I heard a paper, this was not about the UK, but I heard a paper 2 years ago at an ECPR conference where disability was being determined by looking at a photograph or a video. Now that not only privileges physical disability, but the whole thing, I mean, I don't know how that got past ethics either, to be honest, but I think we need to be really careful about assuming that you can read off from visual cues identity, not least because we can't always, we won't get it right, but we're also privileging one or other, and I think that is problematic. So, for example, we can look at the ethnicity gap in the House of Commons. We can look to see that actually the gains are on the Labour side in so many ways, despite that image, if you like, of the new cabinet. So, 63% of black and minority ethnic MPs are on the Labour, but there are none in Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland. We need to look at those questions around how the intersections of ethnicity and sex play out. But I want to go a little bit further. This is a drawing, there's a number of drawings by this feminist illustrator that Karen and I employed for a different book. Hazel McCoubry, who does fantastic illustrations. If you're interested, you can find her on Etsy. But I want us to think about that risk of reading off. What is it that this little girl is seeing when she looks down into her legislative chamber? How do we know which of those representatives she sees as being representative of her? Because we can make misrepresentations here. We might expect her to see the descriptive, but we might not. And it might be that age becomes really important for this girl, a young girl. And we have to address those questions of sex and gender and to recognise that actually the audience might be where we need to be looking. So to what extent are the representative claims being made by the representatives a site of descriptive representation? Now, I'm not suggesting that's a simple task or necessarily easy, but I think it's where the literature is. It's where we need to go to get a much better sense of how well women are descriptively represented. And I thought, Khurshid, your point yesterday about the construction of this political category. We often, I think traditionally within political science, see representation as a passive thing, that we can observe it after the event. And actually this idea, and this has been really reinforced to me by a book by Lisa Dish, but representation is a mobilisation activity. We create, we construct through the process of representation. And it seems to me that we need, as political scientists, better measurements and judgments of the quality of descriptive representation, even though that's the one that's supposed to be easy, right? We're just supposed to be able to tick it off. But actually, complicated conceptions of sex and gender come to the fore, intersectional appreciation, problematizes and challenges who is a descriptive representative of who, and then looking at those more active understandings of descriptive representation challenges even more. So there's a lot more that I could sort of say about this, but I'll leave that to Q&A or some other time. At the same time, I don't want to give up, as I've said on the counting, nor do I want to give up on the kind of interventions that can transform the composition of our political parties, their candidates. And we know that certain policies like quotas can work. We know they won't work where you don't have a party, and we've got to be creative. But it seems to me that the world is not lacking for, they might be lacking in your part of the world, but mostly we're not lacking understanding of what the solutions are. What we're lacking is political will, incentives and sanctions. That's what matters if we want to. We could transform political parties very, very quickly if we had the power. Same old political science question. Okay, so what were the expectations on this group of 1997 women? And I ask what kind of feminist expectations were being assumed or read in or onto those women. I mean, they were high profile, they were incredible. The honeymoon did not last very long. Soon we know they were Blair's babes. That was I've said this before, last couple of days, this was Daily Mail misogyny, right? Let's not just think that image that has been now downgraded and is apologised for and is felt to be offensive was not experienced like that at the time by the women who were part of it. And that's because of its reception. So they were Stepford wives, they were overly loyal, they were the uncritical mass, they were this monstrous mini regiment of women. They, whined about the hours of the house, they couldn't cope with the pressure. All of these kind of stereotypes and accusations very much dominated the media pretty quick. And if they began to offer a gendered critique of the Parliament, again, it was their fault. They couldn't cope. It was like, the idea of, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen kind of idea. We didn't allow that gendered critique of the institution to actually be a gendered critique of the institution. It became a criticism of them. They weren't up to the job. They hadn't been subjected to sufficient competition through all-women shortlists that had just given a nice easy route in, or they hadn't been unopposed, therefore they were substandard. All of these kind of claims started to sort of create this idea that there were loads of them leaving en masse, crying and exiting. It wasn't true empirically in 2001, but it really sort of caught the public's imagination. And that naivety, I think now, of asking what difference they would make, despite its attractions, because all of these, that's kind of like a feminist fantasy of what would happen when a large number of women go into an institution, right? But actually, perhaps we as academics, as an interested public, as feminist activists, may have invested too much. I keep using that word invested, and I think that's really quite an important. That when we think about being well represented in politics, we must be attentive to ideological and intersectional diversity. Of course, we need to understand the masculinized political institutions that constrain the ability of representatives to be transformative, whether that's in the institution as a workplace or in terms of the outputs that it produces. Too frequently, it seems to me, we assume that the substantive representation of women, so acting in the interests of women, does mean the feminist interests of women. Now, we might prefer that. I'm just using the collective we in a royal sense here. But we can't assume that when we think about ideological diversity and when we think about other differences. Now, the pioneering work by people like Anne Phillips on presence theories was much more attentive to difference than the way in which that work is used and the everyday translation of those kind of ideas. We need to think about good representatives, good descriptive representatives. Suzanne Dovey here is really important. She talked about preferable descriptive representatives. Not any old woman will do. We need to be able to judge between them. Thinking about notions of affinity and mutual relationships with those who are the most marginalised, so the subgroups within any category. And scholarship has become much richer by using and developing feminist institutionalism, which really takes seriously the gendered norms and rules that operate within our political arenas and that constrain, but nonetheless still offer the opportunity of transformation. So we've moved away from those conceptions of the difference that women will make to how the substantive representation of women takes place, and to the workings of our parliaments, and to a much lesser extent our political parties. And it seems to me there's so much more work and focus on parliaments, gender sensitising parliaments globally, and we need that same kind of attention on political parties. We need to do the kind of applied work, the transformative, the impactful research on parties again. I thought Dawn Primarolo's articulation of the importance of listening was really critical yesterday. We talk a lot about making sure that women's voices are included in politics, but actually we need to think about how well are they being listened to, and to do so within a much more sophisticated understanding of political representation, which recognises that representative democracies cannot deliver everything to everybody all of the time, but that the process of representation needs to be democratic and needs to be feminist, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. We have ongoing poverty of women's representation. These reflections come from Feminist Democratic Representation, a book Karen and I published in 2020, where we tried to look, take a step back and look again at where we got to. So the book originally was just going to be like, this is what we think about representation. Then we realised it became a much bigger project when we wanted to really challenge and remake a case for women's group representation in politics, but one that had an intersectional and ideological kind of update. So it really underscores a concern with redesigning political institutions in feminist ways. So Feminist Democratic Representation, the book, is a much more theoretical book, but it's trying to engage in restating how we can move beyond systems, representative democracy, that deliver a politics where women can still be, even when present, not listened to and not responded to, where there are too few incentives to be concerned about politically representing well women, and within that particularly minority and marginalised women. The kind of principles that we want to see enacted, we argue should be inclusiveness, responsiveness, and egalitarianism. So when women's voices and interests are too often, perhaps they're heard but not listened to, or when women's interests are addressed or frequently misrepresented and claims are made for them but not with them or by them, then a politics, even a representative politics, will not connect women to their political institutions. And we think that political elected representatives can too easily ignore women because of the way in which party so often dominates. There is no formal or institutional obligation to represent. So the question of accountability, representative democracy, and theories of representation and gender have spent too little time on the question of accountability. But inclusiveness, responsiveness, and egalitarianism as principles, as democratic principles to be enacted in political institutions, gives us the capacity to actually judge whether women's heterogeneous interests are amongst those claims for women that are functioning, that are outside but also within our political institutions. To what extent are those concerns that operate within civil society and amongst women, are those claims being reflected within our political institutions, our political actors responding to those kind of agendas? And we need to think about the relative status of diverse voices and different women's interests. Because without a commitment to egalitarianism, we might over time see the same women's interests being privileged and prioritised. So we might get a partial regendering, but one that is skewed to elite and dominant women. So let me try to leave you with like thinking points. I know you all will go home and have a drink and watch Netflix or something to think about. I mean, hey, that's what I want to do on the train, going home. To try and bring this back to some of the other themes and ideas that have come out in the historical context. Gender insensitive institutions, naming the arenas where women politicians act, where they've entered into, but where they need to be transformed, and to think about just how harmful those institutions can be. We don't often think about it in those terms, although obviously Lindsay's comments about alcohol was one example of them. But I think there's other everyday activities of how institutions can harm women by privileging a particular understanding of the unencumbered representative who can operate all night. And you get terribly excited in Brexit votes because they can now stay up till 3 o'clock and get a bacon sandwich. And isn't it great? And this is how politics used to be before those downmoving came in and wanted baked potatoes for lunch. I'm not exaggerating on that quotation. One of the earlier talks made me think about when I first went to a parliamentary breakfast. It was like nearly all women. It was like long tables, like 2 men at the end. And they served a fry-up on like a Wednesday at 8:30 in the House. And that's what a parliamentary breakfast was. And all these women that literally ate the fried egg, and then all of these sausages and bacon and beans and everything else just got left. And actually, I subsequently went to another one where it suddenly had gone continental, and you thought, this is the feminization of parliament, right? A masculinized breakfast. Now, it's not that I'm trying to suggest in any essentialist fashion that women don't like. Oh, did I knock it off?
No, just more battery power.
Okay. So I'm not trying to suggest in any essentialist fashion that we don't like big breakfast. I mean, we all do brunch and avocado on toast and all those kinds of things these days. But, you know, it was a quite interesting symbolic representation of what the parliamentary staff considered to be an appropriate parliamentary breakfast. Anyway, as I said, we just circulated, pushed everything else aside and just had the eggs. So gender insensitive institutions, that's now sounding like a rather ridiculous comment, but then I'm always reminded, I remember I was doing a talk about the Good Parliament report, and I'd said about how one of the changes had been a new rule about portraits, because there used to be a 10-year dead rule, right? So you couldn't have your portrait in the Palace of Westminster unless you had been dead for 10 years. Brought in to stop Nancy Astor's portrait, by the way, so a misogynist rule from the start. And I sort of said, well, you know, is that, I think I was being rather flippant about that being one of the changes and how important was that. And Rosie Campbell had a real go at me and told me that there are really clear evidences that if you have certain kinds of images on the wall, girls do really good in maths tests. So actually we do sometimes make flippant comments about what we think is and is not important about changes within a parliament. And I think we need to be a little bit more careful about that. We need to think about how we bring about change in these institutions, whether that's a parliament, but also I think much more attention needs to be given to political parties. And to think about the way in which we can understand strategies and devise those strategies, attentive to both the institutional formal rules, the informal rules, norms, cultures, actors, and to think about who might be our gatekeepers, might be our multipliers, where will the blockage be, what kind of extra parliamentary or extra party dynamics can you mobilise. How can you build new institutions within established ones? And I think about the establishment of the Women and Equalities Committee, or the way in which we had to develop new relationships, and how, for example, in the process of bringing about baby leave for MPs, proxy voting for MPs on baby leave, the institution of the mother of the house gets created. So Harriet Harman is able to build something out of this title that actually, again, Nancy Astor, it was used once or twice about Nancy Astor. Harman had used it a few times to no noticeable effect, but then Theresa May draws attention to Harriet Harman being mother of the house, and suddenly you see this claim being made that actually, as the mother of the institution, there is additional authority and legitimacy to the interventions of Harriet Harman. So you can build new institutions to bring about change, but not to be wildly romantic and optimistic and to think about gender power struggles and how we have to recognise resistance, backlash, violence against women in politics. And here I think your new colleague, if you're at Queen Mary, Sophia's work on violence against women in politics is absolutely critical. And to think in the face of these kind of resistors and the different forms of resistance, how you have to develop relationships with critical actors and exploit critical moments. And to think about the way in which, for example, COVID-19 looked as if it might be the moment to introduce greater gender change, but actually the politics of the moment, whether that's Brexit, a more populist-oriented Conservative Party, very traditionalist leader of the House, actually it's a very obvious turn away. So 25 years seems quite a long time ago, as I said, and I can't quite believe it is that long ago. That's, I guess, what ageing does to you. But really to stress the importance of, when we think about and study gender and politics, that I really do passionately believe that we need to change the world and not just study it. And I think that may be easier for political scientists than it is for historians, but I think over the last few days, I think there's been so much that I've really enjoyed about that I think I can learn from. But I also would want to say, finally, a few words about universities and the political economy of research. I think we've had babies at this conference, which has been fantastic. I mean, I know they've been very good, and maybe we wouldn't say that if they know that's not true. They've been very good. But we need to think about research funding on gender and research. We need to think about motherhood and academic careers. And I think we need to really ensure that we are a community that works across disciplines and across generations. And those in very established positions have an obligation to support those who are precarious. And if anybody's worried about finishing their PhD, because I know a couple of people have said the odd thing over the last couple of days, it took me 7 years, so just keep at it and you'll get there. Thank you very much.